and their struggle for democracy and human rights. Not one single word.
You've heard it for an hour and a half.
I haven't heard any mention of the democratic grassroots organizations that exist even today all across Syria, who are campaigning for a democratic state, a secular state, a state where women have rights, equal rights, where religious minorities have rights. I haven't heard a single word from any of these speakers about that. Instead, I've heard a de facto defense of a fascist regime. The Syrian regime is fascist. It has never had free and fair elections in over 4 decades. Bashar's father and Bashar have both been brought to power under fraudulent elections. No free and fair elections, no opposition, no free press, no right to protest. For those of us who work in human rights, and I've been doing it for 51 years, I can tell you about the journalists, the doctors, the lawyers, the human rights defenders, the trade unionists, political oppositionists who've been jailed and tortured in Syria, not just in the last few years, but for the last 40 years. I can tell you about the people snatched off the streets by the secret police, by both Hafez and Bashir's goons, and tortured in quasi-concentration camps. Why haven't we heard a single word about that? Why haven't we heard about Russia? Russia is a quasi-fascist state. It's not fully fascist yet. It is a police state which imprisons trade unionists, leftists, LGBT people, women's rights campaigners, journalists, and human rights defenders, many of whom have been murdered. Why would any progressive person give even 1 minute's time to the propaganda that comes out of Moscow today? We should be standing with the Russian people in their struggle for freedom and democracy, and not allying or in any way giving an inch to a regime which is committing war crimes in Syria now, and which has committed war crimes in the eastern Ukraine, in Georgia, and before that in Chechnya. Who was the great mass murderer of Chechnya? Vladimir Putin. He razed Grozny to the ground, killing tens of thousands of civilians, and he's doing the same today in Syria. So my question is, I don't believe the mainstream media narrative, but what I've heard today is a mirror reflection of the Western elites, because it's all been about Western think tanks, Western politicians, military leaders. Nothing about the people of Syria themselves. All across Syria, in the liberated areas, there are local coordinating committees. These are grassroots community organizations set up by people who've got nothing to do with Islamist extremism. They're the people who marched in 2011 for democracy and were gunned down by Assad's fascist police and army. These organizations run the local communities. They are opposed to the Islamist extremists. And if these people have been doing any kind of research, they would know there have been mass protests in Aleppo, Idlib, Homs against the extremists by the democratic movement of 2011. I'm sure that there are some Western leaders and military chiefs who had plans like you've outlined. I've got no doubt about that. But what has happened in Syria was a genuine grassroots democratic movement. Nothing to do with Western powers. Not engineered by them, not orchestrated by them, not funded by them. The mass movement out of the Arab Spring in 2011 was a genuine people's movement for democracy by Syrian people who are fed up with their sons and daughters, their fathers and mothers being tortured in Assad's torture centers and prisons. Now, I'm speechless. I don't believe these people are bad people, but I just believe that I take my reference from the people in Syria, the heroes and heroines who marched in 2011 because they wanted a democratic state and wanted human rights for all Syrian people. What happened? Assad gunned them down. And then he freed the Islamist extremists he had in prison so he could create this narrative about fighting a war on terror. I've heard the white helmets besmirched. I don't know, and I can't say the white helmets are perfect. And maybe there are some incidents where white helmets have done bad things. But overall, the white helmets are heroes. And everybody in the world should support their quest to save lives. The fact that they are funded from the West, which is true, that doesn't make them bad. For heaven's sake, the West funded the anti-Nazi resistance in occupied Europe. Did that make those people imperialist stooges? Of course not. I am struggling to maintain my quietness because a different situation. Okay, false analogy. All I can say is I stand with the people against tyranny. Assad is a fascist dictator supported by another totalitarian autocrat, Vladimir Putin. Russia today is a neo-imperialist state. I do not for 1 minute support military intervention. I do not support the Western agenda. I'm against that as well. In the old days, when the Socialist Workers' Party had its head screwed on correctly, it used to say, neither Washington nor Moscow. A very good and apt and appropriate slogan which we should learn from today. But I just cannot buy the story we've heard today from these speakers who seem to be justifying what Russia and Assad is doing in Syria. I don't believe it adds up on facts, and the most important thing is they've excluded entirely from what they've said the struggle by the Syrian people. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, mate.
Okay, Peter, you asked for it. Tell you about the people of Syria. I'll tell you about the gays who are being thrown off the top of roofs in the areas controlled by the people that you objectively are supporting. If we stop supporting the Assad government, the jihadis will take over and all your friends in the gay movement in Syria will have their days numbered. Think about them. Think about the other Syrians. You have had your chance. You will have another chance tomorrow. So let us not preempt that. But do not you take the moral high ground, Peter Tatchell. Do not attempt to take the moral high ground with your Russophobia and your disruptive tactics. You are no friend of the left. You tried to bring down Jeremy Corbyn. You are on that side of the argument. You do not belong in the rebel tent. You are no rebel.
Just very quickly, on any objective reading of what we have seen in the international system for the last 20 years, the countries who are primarily responsible for instigating and then fueling conflicts in the international system have been the Western governments. It has not been Russia. And the empirical record is very, very clear on that. So if we're concerned about saving lives, and if we're concerned about trying to improve the state of the world, the first thing we need to do is to address the countries who are initiating conflicts, which are causing massive loss of life in the international system. And there's no point in you and I having an argument in front of all these people. I recommend people go away and read the literature, read the Chilcot report, see the conflicts which have been occurring, look at the money and resources that the West has been pouring into these conflicts. I talk to people in the military, I don't just talk to people in the left or whatever. I know what's going on. This is what's going on, and these conflicts are being fueled and instigated by us. We need to stop that, and then we can start to look at issues surrounding behaviour of countries, etc., in the way that you've been talking about it. The big problem we have at the moment are wars which are hugely destructive, and the numbers are undoubtedly well over 1 million, probably in the millions now, of people who've died in the international system because of what our governments are doing.
Peter Tatchell, you claimed I didn't speak for the Syrian people. When was the last time you went to Syria?
I never went to South Africa, but I knew what apartheid was.
When did you go to Syria?
I haven't been to Syria.
Thank you. The liberated areas, as you call them, or free Syria, as the British government would love to call them. So thank you for being a mouthpiece for the Tory government interventionist project in Syria. when you talk about liberated, shame on you. You call yourself a humanitarian, and yet you support the sanctions on all the Syrian people. What do you think is decimating the Syrian state? What do you think is decimating humanitarian care? I'm lying. You can't debate civilly.
Let's civil debate. Peter.
You called me a liar.
I do not support sanctions.
Peter, I'll give you the microphone.
I do not support
Syria. As such, you support the sanctions on the Syrian government that do not affect the Syrian government. They affect the humanitarian sectors inside Syria. The liberated areas that you describe may have some degree of, as you call it, grassroots organisation, but that works under the control of the extremist factions. Even the BBC has admitted to that. Unlike you, Peter Tatchell, I have been in East Aleppo during the liberation. I have been in Eastern Ghouta, and I have spoken even to those who were against the Syrian government in the early days, but who suffered not under the Syrian government, but under the ideologically extreme, sectarian, racist, homophobic regime of the extremist factions that you effectively support with your rhetoric. You do. Your rhetoric enables
Shame on you
them.
for lying.
Your rhetoric enables them, as does the rhetoric of the mainstream media, the think tanks, the UN, and our government agencies.
You've made about 4 false allegations against me. I'm not going to sit here silently, but you can carry on.
And as for the white helmets and the bad apples, as you've described them, and as they're described in Western media and in their billionaire protectionist cartel, including Hollywood, as we well know, how many other first response organisations have been fated to such an extent? So you consider a few bad apples dismembering the corpses of prisoners of war, or attending summary executions, carrying out the torture of civilians, abducting children from Rashdin and not returning them. You consider those to be a few bad apples, and you don't consider that there should be an independent investigation into this organisation? Or do you forget the recent parliamentary released report on the number of UN agencies carrying out exploitation and sexual violence against refugee children? You don't think that there should be an investigation into an organisation that has been accused by the Syrian people of abducting children for organ theft and for child trafficking? You don't think that there should be an investigation into that organisation, Mr. Tatchell?
I never said that. I'm quite happy for there to be an investigation.
They were heroes, and you said they should not be attacked.
I said they should. I said they were heroes. I never said there should not be an investigation. I'm quite happy for there to be an investigation. So please withdraw that other false allegation.
Patrick.
I don't want to have a knuckle-dragging, knockdown debate with Mr. Tatchell, because he's got much more experience at this than I do. But, Peter, you said that we haven't done any research. Here's my research. Okay, that is in an area that was funded by a parallel government, paid for by this government. You've got $100 million to shovel to this search and rescue outfit that makes movies for CNN. And they're closing down fire brigade stations in the vicinity of Grenfell Tower. You don't have the money for fire brigade in London, but we can throw 150 million for a propaganda film production outfit, which is essentially what the white helmets are. I'm sorry. And if you want to look at research, go to clarityofsignal.com and you'll see 100 images of different white helmets, and they brag about this on their Facebook page in Arabic, wearing their Al-Qaeda uniforms with weapons. Okay, so if you had one of those at the International Red Cross, Peter, or Bernardo's, or Oxfam, look what happened to Oxfam with one bad apple. Look what happened to Oxfam. You've got 100 of them, and counting, with the white helmets. At what point does it become a farce, is my question. But On the point, Peter, on the moral point, I absolutely agree with you. We should be siding with the oppressed. We should be fighting fascism in all its forms and dictators and so forth. But the moral argument you're making is the exact same moral argument George Bush made before the Iraq War. So at what point, what price is it worth? So what is the solution? Is it to, as our governments have done, spend billions of dollars recorded to funnel and traffic weapons to moderate rebel groups in Syria that have massacred people with those weapons and tow missiles, okay, from our friend John McCain? Is that a moral solution? But that's what our governments are doing. We are trafficking and flooding arms to terrorists in a region. Are we exacerbating the problem? But that's their solution for this new paradigm. 15 years ago, it was bomb and airstrikes. It was hard power. Now it's soft power and proxy power. It's the same result. Destruction, devastation. So in effect, you're cheerleading for the same result. I don't disagree with you on the moral point, Peter, at all. I absolutely agree with you. The problem we have as a society is how to determine how to get there without killing 1 million people in the process.
I'm going to give Peter the right to go. Okay.
Can I just make one more point
One
as
more
well?
point, Vanessa.
You mentioned the uprisings in Aleppo. If you actually go to Aleppo, as I have done, and speak to both East and West Aleppo, you will know that there was never an uprising in Aleppo. The whole reason that Aleppo was invaded in 2012 is because it refused to side with the pseudo-revolution. Ali Hashem, why did he leave Al Jazeera very early on? Because Al Jazeera refused to air his reports saying that militants were pouring in from Lebanon and from Jordan to increase the numbers of the so-called revolution. Speak to people like Tony Al-Sayo from Aleppo, a Syrian, who will tell you exactly what happened, the invasion of East Aleppo, the fleeing of 500,000 people from East Aleppo to West Aleppo. Did they flee to government-protected West Aleppo so they could be gassed? They fled there for safety. Every single liberated area, we don't see the civilians leaving on the buses with the extremist factions. We see the civilians staying. We see them being escorted via the humanitarian corridors to safety. What did the US or the UK do in Raqqa to extricate the civilians safely from inside Raqqa while they were liberating Raqqa from ISIS? Or what did we see the US coalition doing in Mosul to get civilians out safely while they were liberating Mosul from ISIS? Thank you.
That was lively, and it's a lively issue. And thank you to the panel, thank you to Peter, and thank you to all of the audience for taking part in that lively session. Tomorrow, or is it Sunday tomorrow? I've been here since Wednesday. So tomorrow there's a debate with Peter and Peter. Sorry, yeah, I've got to give you one more question, but the thing is we've run over time and I've got Craig Murray. What time is it now? 5:30, yeah, so I'm going to give him 1 minute, yeah, and a really brief response if that's because I did promise him, yeah, last one.
Yeah, very quickly.